The concourse smelled of fear. Veyra had catalogued enough chemical signatures in her 30 years to recognize the acrid tang instantly, a cocktail of stress pheromones from a dozen different species flooding the recycled air of the Vanthari commercial hub until her antennae ached from the saturation. She walked the rows slowly, all four arms visible and unthreatening, her two heavy crushing claws held low and open at her sides, while her smaller manipulators carried water pouches. 400 beings sat on the polished floor of what had been, 6 hours ago, the busiest trade concourse in the sector. Now it was a cage. She stopped beside a Vilni merchant whose long fingers were wrapped around a personal halo, the projection flickering with the faces of what had to be his family. When Veyra extended a water pouch toward him, he flinched so violently that his neck frill snapped flat against his skull. His eyes locked on her crushing claws, on the salvaged military rifle magnetically clamped to her thorax plate, on the mottled blue-gray carapace that marked her as Drethkai, and therefore, today, as the enemy. She set the water down beside him and moved on without a word. There was nothing she could say that would matter. She was the thing with the gun. 12 rows ahead, a young Thessari medical student sat perfectly still, her bioluminescent skin patterns cycling through random noise, the involuntary stress response of a species whose emotions wrote themselves across their bodies. Veyra had seen the same thing in her own clutchmates when they were small, the way their chromatophores would stutter and scramble when they were too frightened to think. She placed water beside the Thessari, too, and this time she clicked her mandibles softly, the Drethkai equivalent of a reassuring murmur, though she doubted the girl understood it. Near the far wall, a voice called out in Drethkai, and Veyra turned one eye stalk to find its source. A Drethkai trader, one of their own species, a merchant who had been conducting business on the hub when Kesav's people seized it. He was older, his carapace worn smooth with age, and he was looking at Veyra with an expression she recognized because she had seen it on her own face in reflective surfaces for the past 6 hours. Shame. He said Kesav's name, and then he said please, and then he said stop, just those 3 things. Veyra's ventral plates tightened involuntarily, a deep, muscular contraction that pressed her internal organs closer together, the Drethkai body's oldest response to social pain. She moved past him without answering, because there was no answer she could give that would be true and also kind. 20 guards patrolled the concourse with her, 20 Drethkai from a dying colony world who had traded their civilian clothes for salvaged armor and weapons that most of them barely knew how to use. They were teachers, engineers, fishery workers, a poet. Veyra had trained them herself over 3 desperate weeks in a cargo bay, teaching them how to hold a rifle without shooting their own feet, how to clear a room, how to restrain without injuring. She had not taught them how to be soldiers because they were not soldiers. They were parents whose children were starving, and the galaxy had offered them silence and procedure until silence and procedure became indistinguishable from murder. Kesav's voice echoed from the station's speakers, strong and commanding, rolling through his demands with the precise cadence of a practiced orator. Colony ship. Terraforming resources. A public admission from the Galactic Council that they had abandoned the Drethkai of Vareth 4. Veyra tilted one eye stalk toward the nearest speaker and listened to her oldest friend perform the role of revolutionary, and she heard what no one else in the station could hear, the hairline fractures in his voice, the microsecond pauses where his rhythm faltered. Kesav was a colony administrator who had once spent his days arguing about irrigation budgets. He was held together now by fury and insomnia, and nothing else. She left the concourse and took the maintenance lift to the command level. The corridor was empty except for 2 guards she had stationed at the blast doors, young Drethkai who straightened when they saw her. She waved them back to ease and pushed through into the operations center. Kesav stood alone in front of the tactical display. The holographic projection showed the Vanthari hub at center and surrounding it, close enough that their running lights were visible through the station's viewports, the Peacekeeper assault fleet, 12 warships, 4 breach shuttles. Sniper platforms already locked onto every airlock. The blue glow of the display painted Kesav's carapace in cold light, and Veyra could see the fine network of stress fractures spreading across his dorsal plates, tiny lines where the chitin was literally splitting from sustained cortisol flooding. His crushing claws hung at his sides and they were shaking. He did not turn when she entered. She came to stand beside him and looked at the fleet. "How long since you slept?" she asked. He made a dismissive sound with his gill slits, a wet exhalation that meant the question was irrelevant. "The Council responded," he said. His voice was raw, stripped of the performance cadence. "They sent warships. Not diplomats, not aid, warships." Veyra's antennae swept the air around him and caught the chemical profile of exhaustion layered over desperation, layered over something she did not want to name. She had known Kessoff since they were juveniles in the same tidal pool, since before the colony's slow death had turned a thoughtful bureaucrat into whatever he was becoming now. "What happens when the deadline passes?" she asked. He did not answer. His crushing claws trembled against his legs. In the silence that followed, Veyra felt the pressure bladder along her back ridge begin to inflate. The ancient threat display organ swelling with fluid as her body prepared for a danger her conscious mind had been refusing to calculate. She forced it down, clamping the bladder flat with a flex of her dorsal muscles, and the effort made her segments click involuntarily along every joint. He had never had a plan for this part. The seizure itself had been meticulously organized, every rotation timed, every guard position mapped, every hostage zone supplied with water and medical kits because Veyra had insisted on it. But after was a void. The demands were a shout into a canyon, and Kessoff had expected an echo that never came. And now they were standing in the silence with a fleet outside and 400 terrified people below, and absolutely no path forward that did not end in blood. She was calculating how many of her guards she could convince to surrender voluntarily when the airlock alert sounded. The alarm was a sharp, oscillating tone that meant the primary docking caller was cycling. Veyra's compound eyes snapped toward the security feed, both stalks swiveling in unison, and she expected to see the angular silhouettes of a Peacekeeper breach team flooding through in tactical formation, shields up, weapons hot. One figure walked through the airlock. No armor, no helmet, no visible weapon. The figure was bipedal, mammalian, wearing simple dark clothing that looked like civilian office wear, hands raised, palms forward, fingers spread in a gesture of openness that was either universal or deliberately calculated to appear so. The station's bioscanners confirmed what Veyra's eyes were already telling her. Human. Female. Unarmed. Alone. The human stopped 3 paces inside the airlock and stood still, waiting with a patience that seemed almost aggressive in its calm. Veyra watched her guards raise weapons, watched the targeting beams dance across the human's chest, and she barked a command to hold. The human did not flinch at the weapons. She did not raise her voice. She said, in accented but perfectly functional Galactic standard, that her name was Liaison Diane Okoro and that she would like to speak with whoever was in charge. Veyra studied her through the security feed. The human was older, her dark skin lined around the eyes and mouth in ways that suggested decades of expression rather than hardship. She wore small optical aids perched on her nose, and she carried nothing in her hands, nothing on her belt, nothing that the scanners could identify as technology or threat. Her antennae swept the feed for a chemical read, but the sensors were not calibrated for human biology. Later, when Diane was in the room, Veyra would catch the chemical signature directly, and she would not be able to classify it. It was not fear. It was not aggression. It was not the performance calm of someone suppressing terror. It was something steady and deep, like bedrock. Months later, she would learn the human word for it. Resolve. She ordered the guards to bring the human to the command level. Diane Okoro walked into the operations center with the same measured pace she had used in the airlock. Unhurried, deliberate, as if the armed Drethkai flanking her were an honor guard rather than captors. She looked at the tactical display showing the fleet. She looked at the stress fractures on Kessoff's carapace. She looked at his trembling claws. Veyra, watching from the corner of the room with one eye stalk on each of them, saw Diane's gaze linger on those shaking claws for exactly 2 seconds before she looked away, and she understood with a cold certainty that this human had just read Kessoff more accurately than most Drethkai could. Kessoff drew himself up and delivered his demands. The full version, rehearsed, polished, weighted with righteous anger and political framing. Colony ship. Terraforming package. Public acknowledgement. He spoke for 4 minutes without pause, and his voice was almost steady, and he kept his crushing claws locked behind his back where the shaking would not show. Diane listened to every word. She did not interrupt. She did not reach for a communicator. She did not shift her weight or check any device or display the thousand small signs of impatience that Veyra had seen from every council official who had ever deigned to hear a Drethkai petition. When Kesso finished, the room was silent except for the ambient hum of the station's systems and the faint clicking of Veyra's segment joints. Diane said, "Tell me about the colony." Kesov stared at her, his mandibles parted in confusion. He repeated his demands, louder as if volume would bridge whatever incomprehension this human was suffering from. "I heard your demands," Diane said. Her voice was quiet, not soft but low, the kind of quiet that somehow took up more space in a room than shouting. "I want to understand why you are here, not the political framework. You, what happened to you?" Kesov started to answer with rhetoric, with the language of grievance he had refined over 3 years of ignored petitions, and then he stumbled. The rehearsed words caught somewhere in his throat, and what came out instead was ragged and unpolished and real. The crops failed. He said it simply, like a confession. The crops failed. The gene-modified kelp beds that fed the colony suffered a blight that the Agricultural Ministry had warned the council about 2 years before it hit. The warning was filed. The blight came. 70% of the food supply collapsed in a single growing season. Kesov had been the administrator who filed the emergency petition, the one who spent 11 months navigating council bureaucracy, who filled out the forms in triplicate, who attended the hearings where officials nodded sympathetically and took notes that were never read. He told her about the form numbers, the actual form numbers. Petition 7 Gamma Ra, subsection 12, Emergency Resource Allocation for Sub-Threshold Colony Worlds. He had memorized them the way soldiers memorize weapons designations. Diane sat down, not in a chair because there were no chairs sized for humans in the Drethkai configured operations center. She sat on the floor, cross-legged, and the act of lowering herself changed the geometry of the room in a way that Veyra felt in her antennae. The power dynamic shifted. This was not an interrogation. It was a conversation. "Tell me about the children," Diane said. Kesov's voice broke, not dramatically, not with a sob or a shout. It cracked the way his carapace was cracking, a stress fracture running through something that was supposed to be strong, and the sound it made was small and terrible. He told her about the first season after the blight, how the adults rationed their food to feed the juveniles, how the Drethkai body could survive on reduced nutrition for months, but juvenile carapace growth could not. And the children began showing up at the medical station with shells so thin you could see the shadows of their organs through the chitin. He told her about the sound, specifically of a child's carapace cracking during a routine growth molt, a sound that was supposed to be a crisp, healthy snap and instead became a wet splintering that meant the new shell underneath was not strong enough to replace the old one. Diane asked about the hospital. Not a general question, but a specific one that proved she had been assembling a picture from every word he said. She asked how many beds the colony medical station had and how many children needed them. 40 beds, Kesov said. 312 children in critical nutrient deficit at the peak. He had those numbers memorized too. Over the next 2 hours, the real story came out, pulled from Kesov not by force or leverage, but by a quality of attention that Veyra had never encountered in any species. Diane listened the way the deep ocean listens, absorbing everything, reflecting nothing back prematurely. She asked questions that proved she was not simply waiting for her turn to speak. She asked about the medicine that ran out, about the specific compound that Drethkai juveniles needed for shell development and which the colony had requested through 7 separate supply channels, all of which terminated in the same automated response system. About Kesov's own egg clutch. 5 eggs, 3 hatched healthy. 2 did not survive the first molting season. When he said this, his mandibles stopped moving entirely, locked in a position Veyra recognized as the Drethkai expression of grief, too deep for sound. Diane did not fill the silence. She waited. Veyra had seen council mediators fill silences reflexively, rushing to the next agenda item, the next protocol point. Diane let the quiet sit in the room like a third presence, and Veyra understood instinctively that this was not passivity. It was a deliberate act, a space being held open for Kesov to decide what came next. He told her about the council representative who visited the colony, who walked through the children's ward with an expression of practiced concern, who told Kesov that resource allocation to minor colony worlds was under review, and who signed a trade agreement the following week worth more than the entire Veyra 4 annual budget. The representative had brought a gift for the medical station, a ceremonial plaque. Kesov described the plaque in detail, the polished alloy and the engraved platitudes, and his voice when he described it carried a contempt so concentrated that Veyra's antennae registered it as a distinct chemical signature, sharp and acrid. They hung it in the ward, he said. The children liked how it caught the light. They were too young to read what it said. By the end of the second hour, Kesov's voice was raw, the performance entirely gone, and Veyra realized she had never heard him speak like this. In 30 years of friendship, through breeding seasons and bureaucratic wars and the slow, terrible decline of their world, Kesov had always maintained the composed exterior of an administrator. She was hearing the person underneath for the first time, and the sound of it made her smaller manipulators curl inward against her thorax in the involuntary Drethkai gesture of emotional protectiveness. Diane did not react to any of this with horror. She did not perform sympathy. She said, quietly, that she had seen this before. On human worlds, in human history, communities abandoned by the systems that were supposed to protect them, people who followed every rule until the rules revealed themselves as tools designed to keep them quiet while they died. She told him about a human city, a place where the water supply had been poisoned by cost-cutting decisions made by officials who did not live there, and how the people of that city had filed complaints for years and been told the water was safe while their children grew sick. She did not draw the parallel explicitly. She did not need to. Kesov's eye stalks were locked on her with an intensity Veyra had never seen directed at any non-Drethkai. She did not excuse what Kesov had done. She said plainly that taking hostages was wrong, and that people were frightened and that this would have consequences. But she did not pretend he was a monster. She treated him as a person who had made a terrible choice at the end of a long road of having no choices at all. Veyra's compound eyes were shimmering. The bioluminescent glow that ran along her eye stalks when emotion overwhelmed her processing capacity was building steadily, the Drethkai equivalent of tears, and she could not stop it. She turned her stalks away from the room, pressing them toward the wall as if checking a sensor panel, and tried to force the glow down. It would not go. The comm system chimed. Commander Reth's Peacekeeper fleet requesting contact. Veyra opened the channel and the avian commander's sharp voice filled the room with the clipped efficiency of someone who processed crises in terms of tactical variables. His 2-hour window was up. Breach teams were in position. This was a final notification, not a negotiation. Diane stood. She crossed the room to the comm panel, and Veyra watched every guard in the operations center track her movement with their weapons. Diane did not look at the weapons. She looked at the comm panel's audio indicator, and she spoke directly to Rethis. What she said sent a chemical spike through Veyra's antennae so sharp it registered as a physical sensation, a flash of something between alarm and awe. Diane told Rethis on an open channel that she knew was being monitored by at least 3 galactic news networks, that the Drethkai's grievances were legitimate, that the colony of Veyra 4 had been systematically failed by Council inaction, that a tactical breach of this station would result in hostage casualties and would solve nothing except the Council's desire to bury the story. She told him in a voice that never rose above conversational volume that if Peacekeeper soldiers came through that airlock, the first image the galaxy would see on the evening feeds would be 400 dead civilians and a council that chose a military solution over a conversation. Rethis went silent. The channel hissed with carrier noise for 11 seconds. Veyra counted each one, her gills slit cycling in rapid, shallow breaths that she could not control. Then the Peacekeeper commander gave Diane 2 more hours. He did not sound pleased about it. He sounded like someone who had just been outmaneuvered in a domain he did not know existed. Veyra stared at Diane with both eye stalks fully extended, the maximum aperture of Drethkai attention. This human, this tired older female with optical aids and no weapons, and a voice that never rose above the volume of a personal conversation, had just faced down the most powerful military commander in the sector. She had not used threats. She had not bluffed. She had used the truth, deployed with the precision of a surgical instrument, and the truth had worked because it was true, and because she had made certain that the right people were listening. The fourth hour arrived and the room was different. Kesso was sitting on the floor, among the Drethkai. Lowering yourself below your full standing height in the presence of others was an act of profound vulnerability, a posture reserved for the birthing pool or the deathbed, or the rare moments of absolute trust between bonded pairs. Kessoff had not sat like this in front of anyone other than Veyra since his partner died. And he was sitting like this across from a human he had met 4 hours ago. Diane was on the floor across from him, her legs folded beneath her, her optical aids slightly crooked. There was a water pouch between them that someone had brought, and neither had touched. She asked him what he actually wanted. "Not the man's," she said. "Not the political version. What do you want?" The question hung in the recycled air, and Veyra felt her spiracles tighten along both flanks. The respiratory reflex that Drethkai experienced when they were holding something inside that was too large to release safely. She watched Kesov struggle with the question. He opened and closed his mandibles twice without producing sound. His crushing claws rested on the floor, palms up, and they had stopped shaking. "I want my children to eat," he said. His voice was barely audible. "I want someone to say they matter. I want to go home." Diane nodded. The gesture was human, but its meaning traveled across species without translation. She told him simply that a colony ship was above her authority. She could not promise that, but she could promise him this. If he walked out of this station, she would personally ensure the council heard this story. Not his demands. His story. The children. The hospital. The petitions. The silence. She told him she had 28 years of not walking away from things she had promised, and she was not going to start now. Kessoff looked across the operations center at Veyra. She looked back with both compound eyes. Her manipulator arms were curled so tightly against her thorax that the joints ached. In that look was 30 years of friendship, the shared memory of their dying world, the weight of everything they had done, and everything that had been done to them. She did not nod. She did not signal. But Kessoff had known her long enough to read the answer in her posture, in the way her antennae tilted slightly toward Diane, in the faint shimmer of her eye stalks. He stood. He opened the station-wide channel. His voice, when he spoke, was not the voice of a commandant. It was the voice of an exhausted man choosing to trust someone he had no logical reason to trust. "Lower your weapons." The order moved through the station like a wave. Veyra heard it happen in stages, transmitted through the clicks and shuffles and the heavy, metallic sounds of rifles being set down on polished floors. In the concourse below, 20 Drethkai, who had been holding weapons they barely understood, looked at each other with compound eyes that shimmered and glowed and could not hold steady, and one by one they placed their guns on the ground. Veyra was last. She stood in the operations center with the salvaged rifles still clamped to her thorax plate, and she looked at Diane Okoro, who looked back at her with an expression Veyra could not read, but would spend months trying to understand. Then she detached the magnetic clamp and set the weapon on the floor and felt her carapace erupt in full body clicking, every segment joint chattering at once, the accumulated stress of days releasing through the oldest and most uncontrollable pathway her biology possessed. The sound filled the room and she could not stop it and she did not try. The hostages were released first. Peacekeepers entered through the primary airlock in tactical formation, weapons ready, but Diane was standing between them and the Drethkai with her arms at her sides and her reading glasses reflecting the helmet lights. She did not move. The tactical team parted around her like water around a stone, and she used the time to speak directly to the team leader, and Veyra could not hear the words, but she could see the Peacekeeper's body language shift from assault posture to processing posture. And she understood that Diane had been negotiating surrender terms during that final hour, terms that classified the Drethkai as detainees rather than enemy combatants, terms that included a formal hearing for the colony's petition. Commander Rethis agreed to those terms because by the fourth hour 3 galactic news networks were broadcasting live from the perimeter, and the story had already escaped the framing he had prepared for it. The story was not armed insurgents neutralized. The story was a dying colony that no one listened to. Veyra would later learn that Diane had counted on this. Not hoped for it. Counted on it. She had walked through that airlock, knowing that every minute the negotiation lasted was a minute the real story had to spread, and she had calibrated every hour of conversation to serve that purpose without ever once being dishonest about it. The processing took hours. Biometric scans, restraints, medical evaluations, transport assignments. Veyra moved through it in a daze, her body responding to instructions while her mind replayed the last 6 hours in loops that she could not interrupt. She was in a holding area, wrists bound by magnetic cuffs that hummed faintly against her smaller manipulators, when Diane found her. The human looked tired, not the desperate exhaustion that had hollowed Kesso from the inside out, but the earned fatigue of someone who had just done very hard work for a very long time. She sat down beside Veyra on the holding bench. For a moment, neither spoke. "How did you know?" Veyra asked through her translator. That talking would work. Diane was quiet for a few seconds, and the silence had the texture of honesty rather than hesitation. She said she had not known. She said that most negotiation doctrine, the kind that galactic species practiced, was built on leverage. You found what the other person feared and you used it against them. Human negotiation, the kind she had learned over 28 years in places where human communities had torn themselves apart and then had to figure out how to exist in the same space again, was built on something different. You found what the other person needed and you offered to help carry it. People who take hostages, she said, are not usually monsters. They are usually people who ran out of options and chose the worst one available. The job is not to punish them for that choice. The job is to give them a better one. The bioluminescent glow in Veyra's compound eyes built until it ran the full length of both stalks, bright enough to cast faint blue-green light on the wall beside them. She did not try to stop it. She did not turn away. She told Diane about her egg clutch, about the colony, about her youngest, who had been sick when Veyra left, whose thin carapace had been developing the stress fractures that killed so many Verath IV juveniles, and how she had boarded the transport to the Banthari hub, not knowing if her child would be alive when the news reached her. Diane reached over and took Veyra's smaller manipulator hand, the one not fully encased in the restraint cuff. The human's grip was warm and soft and impossibly gentle for a species that Veyra had been briefed could crush stone with their industrial tools and tear metal with their machines. The warmth traveled through the contact points of Veyra's exoskeleton and reached something underneath that she had not known could be reached. "I will find out about your child," Diane said. "I will get you a message." Veyra believed her. She had no evidence, no leverage, no contractual guarantee. She believed her because of the way Diane held her hand, because of the 6 hours she had just witnessed, because this human had walked unarmed into a hostage crisis and sat on the floor and listened until the guns came down. She believed her because she had no choice left except to believe or to break, and Diane Okoro had given her a reason, however fragile, to choose the former. 6 months passed. Veyra served her sentence at a rehabilitation facility on a station orbiting a neutral world. The sentence was reduced substantially. Diane had testified at the hearing, and the testimony had been devastating in its quiet precision, laying out the timeline of counsel failure with the same methodical attention she had brought to the negotiation. Most of the Drethkai received clemency. Kessov's sentence was longer but not lifelong, and the hearing itself became part of the public record, entered into the archive that the council could not quietly delete. The colony received emergency aid within 3 weeks of the incident, not because the Galactic Council experienced a sudden crisis of conscience, but because the news coverage that Diane had cultivated during those 6 hours made continued inaction politically untenable. 3 networks had broadcast the story. 47 worlds had filed formal inquiries. The Council voted to allocate resources to Verath IV in a closed session that was nonetheless leaked to the press within hours. And Veyra later learned that the leak was traced to a human diplomatic aide whose identity was never officially confirmed. She was in the common area of the rehabilitation facility when a guard brought her a package. Small, nondescript, bearing a human postal service marker. She opened it with her smaller manipulators while her crushing claws rested on the table. Inside was a personal message from Diane, written in Galactic Standard, with the slightly formal grammar of someone who had learned the language as an adult, and never quite lost the textbook phrasing. The message was brief. It said that she had followed the colony's progress, that the aid shipments were arriving, that a new agricultural program was being implemented by a Drethkai-led team, that children were eating. Beneath the message was a holoprojector chip. Veyra activated it, and the image that materialized above the table stopped her breathing. Her youngest, standing upright, carapace gleaming with the healthy blue-gray sheen that Veyra had not seen since the child's first molting, playing in a field of the new gene-resistant kelp crop that had not existed 6 months ago, chasing a tidal crab across the shallow water with the boundless energy of a juvenile who had enough food and enough medicine and enough future to waste time on joy. At the bottom of the package was a small, rigid object, white, rectangular, thinner than a Drethkai data chip. Veyra turned it over in her manipulators and could not identify it. She brought it to a human guard on the facility staff and asked what it was. The guard looked at it and smiled. He said it was called a business card. Veyra turned the card over. On one side, printed in clean human text, was Diane Okoro's name, her title, her contact frequency, her office address. On the other side, in handwriting that was unmistakably personal, the uneven organic strokes of a hand rather than a printer, Diane had written a single line. Whenever you need someone to listen. Veyra held the card in both of her smaller manipulators and pressed it against her thorax, against the hard carapace that covered her ventral hearts, and her compound eyes glowed so brightly that the light filled the common area with shifting blue-green luminance. The guard looked away. Other inmates looked away. They gave her the privacy that her species would never have asked for, but that some other instinct, perhaps universal, told them she needed. She stood there for a long time, holding a small piece of human paper against her chest, letting the glow run uncontrolled, and she did not have a word in Drethkai for what she felt. Her language had terms for grief and fury, and the deep protective ferocity of a mother, and the resignation of a people who had learned to expect nothing. It did not have a word for this, for the feeling of being heard, for the discovery, after years of shouting in the silence, that someone had walked into the noise and sat down and stayed. She thought the humans might call it hope.